QSO Today, episode 399, John Raydo, K0IZ. My thanks to ICOM America for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. Just a note, I will be attending the 4 Days in May event in Fairborn, Ohio, as well as the Dayton Hamvention later this month. If you see me wandering around in an orange baseball cap with the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo patch, be sure to stop me and say hello. I look forward to meeting you. John Raydo, K0IZ, had a great mentor at the beginning of his ham radio story that laid the foundation for John's approach to operating amateur radio and building radio equipment from scratch. John shares this story and how he now remotely controls and has the noise benefit of his rural Colorado rig when operating from his QTH in Missouri. K0IZ is my QSO today. K0IZ, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, John?
Yes, hi, Eric.
John, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, I started building crystal radios around the 6th grade or so. I think probably I got some exposure to it in Cub Scouts. My dad also had an interest in electricity and was actually someone that knew Alan B. Dumont back in New York in the early days of TV. Anyway, I did lots of crystal radios. Didn't know anything about tuning, but it didn't matter because there was a broadcast station about 2 miles away, and so that overwhelmed everything. But I got plenty of signal in my crystal radio.
And you say you made a number of crystal radios. Were they a theme and variation on the same crystal radio, or did you try different things?
Well, I started reading magazine articles about building crystal radios. Some of them were built on big coils, like I think some of the round boxes, oatmeal boxes and things. And then I built little radios with tiny coils in it. Just tried different things. I always was using a cat's whisker, so I didn't know anything about diodes back then.
I think my first one, and I think I came well after you, was a germanium diode as a detector. But if you were using a cat's whisker, what was a cat's whisker?
The cat's whisker is a spring-loaded wire, kind of stiff wire, that presses up against a semiconductor, different types, and actually is half of what was the original transistor. The original transistor was a point contact transistor that had two cat's whiskers, if you would, pressing together, very, very close together. So I guess I was halfway towards a transistor.
And how did it proceed after that? As you were evolving in your radio interest, how did that go?
Well, about in the same time, I was into communications, and my version of a network back then was some Dixie cups and string. And it started out between our treehouse, which was a great big tree about 10 feet up where we would camp out with the kids, and we would talk to each other, somebody on the ground with the string. Then one of us had the idea to tie extra pieces of string on. So I think at one point we had 4 or 5 Dixie cups all connected by string. And so everybody could talk to everybody.
A party line.
Yes, high tech.
At the time with Dixie cups. And so as you were going through school, did you have some encouragement from friends and teachers to pursue an interest in electricity and electronics?
I think mostly it was my dad. He was a master machinist during World War II, doing secret prototyping, and was always technically very interested in things. We had an old wire tape recorder, He gave me an old console radio at one point that I fiddled with. So I was exposed to bits and pieces of it, although early on I didn't understand it very much.
Now, you said you were reading magazines. What magazines were you reading in those days?
If I recall, it was Popular Electronics was the main one. My dad, I do remember, also subscribed to Popular Science, but Popular Electronics had a lot of kind of easy things to do, and the publication started out, I think, just 2 or 3 years before I got interested.
And when did you get your first license?
August of 1957. I was 13. Took me 2 tries to pass the 5 words per minute. One of the neighbors gave me the test, and my original call was Kilo November 0 Lima Mike Zulu, KN0 LMZ. With my dad's help to do some of the mechanical work, I built a transmitter. It was a copy of something in QST and one of the Getting Started manuals, and it had a 6AG7 oscillator into a 6L6 final, so something like 20, 25 watts or so. 40 meters, I had 1 crystal, and my dad helped me find a used Hallicrafters S40B, so that was the start of my ham radio equipment.
And what kind of antenna did you have on that novice station?
It was a very low dipole, probably not more than a dozen feet or so above the ground, and quite frankly, it didn't work very well.
But did you make contacts as a novice?
Oh yes, I did. I operated on CW. I was never terribly good at it, but I still have some of my original logs from about a year later. I still have some of those logs.
Now, I think in those days you were required to upgrade within the year, or your license expired. And did you do that?
Yes, I had trouble with the 13 words per minute, and so I upgraded to the technician class, which is still at 5 words per minute. That was a year later, or within that 1 year span. So the N out of my call was dropped, so I became K0LMZ, and moved me to VHF because technicians didn't have anything below 6 meters. And so for the next few years, I was quite involved with 2-meter activity as a result of that.
And what did 2-meter activity look like in 1958?
It was pretty primitive. I had a HRO 50 receiver, which was a very nice receiver. I did a lot of lawn mowing to get that receiver. People were using a lot of World War II equipment. It was all AM with crystals and pretty much local, 20 miles distance, something like that.
Now, did you use like maybe the Gonset communicators or something like that for AM in those days for transmitting?
No, I built my own equipment, but it was sort of patterned along the same thing, except on the receive side, I was in better shape because I built a converter for the receiver, and that was certainly better than the Heath kits.
So what happened after that? How did you finally upgrade so that you got into the low bands?
Well, again, I was having trouble passing 13 words per minute, and I did do that a couple of years after I got my novice license. I had to go down to the FCC office, which was in downtown Kansas City, Missouri. Rode the bus down there, and it was kind of scary. I was, I guess, 15 at the time, and was psyched out. I did terrible on the code test, and you had to wait, I think, 3 months, if I recall, before you could take it again. And I strategized this second time because always whenever I was copying code, I would miss a letter someplace. And this was all standard English words, but I would screw up somewhere along the line, and you had to do 1 minute of a perfect copy. So I strategized and I copied for about 3.5 minutes and then stopped and looked at what I had and corrected it. So I came up with 1 good minute out of the 3.5.
Oh, that's a great idea. And probably something you might have recommended to other people?
Well, I'm not sure, but it worked for me. And like I said, I was pretty intimidated going down to the FCC office, and wasn't used to that sort of thing.
Now, did you have friends at school that also became hams?
In Kansas City, there was and still is a lot of ham radio activity, and I had two friends in my graduating class at high school. Out of 130 students graduating, three of us were hams, and we all buddied together. All three of us are still ham radio operators, and we stay in touch. And then there were several others, also of our same age group, that were members of the same radio club. So we had quite a group of people and visited stations and talked about things and so forth.
Did you have any mentors or Elmers that helped you along?
I had a number of people who helped me, certainly getting started, with my code and so forth. There was one particular person, Jim McCoy, Whiskey Zero Lima, Quebec Victor. He's unfortunately a silent key. He died about 5 years ago. He was my mentor. He lived near me, about 3 or 4 blocks away. And he was a master craftsman in building ham radio stuff. He had a number of different QST articles and basically taught me how to go about doing it, showing me techniques and so forth. He took the pictures of my first QST article. Anyway, I owed him a great debt for helping getting me started.
Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you then made for your career in education?
I always wanted to be an engineer, so the ham radio activities all was leaning towards that direction, and so it was just a known progress that I was going to become an engineer. And of course, I didn't know too much about it, but continued to work in that direction.
And did you go to university to become an engineer?
I started college in Kansas City at Rockhurst University. It's a liberal arts university. I went there 3 years. They were in a pre-engineering program, and my intention after the 3 years was to transfer to the University of Detroit. Both schools had a cooperative arrangement where I could transfer courses back and forth between the two. And University of Detroit was on a trimester plan where you worked a semester and went to school a semester. And that worked very well for me because TWA in Kansas City was the premier employer. And so I went out to TWA to see about a summer job before moving up to the University of Detroit. And there weren't any summer jobs, but they had just signed up into the program. So they put me into that. And so over the next 3 years, I alternated a semester of work and a semester of school. And not only gave me real work experience, but also gave me some money. I got a BS double E from there and a BA with a math and science from Rutgers College.
What kind of work did you do at TWA?
I started as an engineer, actually a junior engineer when I was still going to school, but was a regular engineer working in the aircraft modification group. And my first assignment was to work with another engineer. And at that point in time, movies were being added to aircraft. So I was involved with installing or designing the little control boxes that the headsets would plug into that would be mounted on the seats, and working with this more senior engineer in really what was pretty leading edge stuff.
And now this message from ICOM America. Field Day is coming on June 26th and 27th, and since it is ham radio's most popular event, you can be a Field Day leader with ICOM. Connect with nature, connect with friends. You will easily cut through the pileups with a powerful and high-quality ICOM base station, the popular ICOM IC705 portable, the ICOM IC7300, and the ICOM IC7610 SDR transceivers are the clear choice for contesters and DXers across the globe. The ICOM IC705 is the perfect transceiver for hams who enjoy both the indoors and the great outdoors on field day. It is the perfect contesting companion because this base station provides features and functionality at the tip of your fingers in a portable package covering HF 6 meters, 2 meters, and 70 centimeters, and it weighs in at just under 2 pounds. Features include a 4.3-inch touchscreen with live band scope and waterfall display, 5 watts with the BP272 battery pack, and 10 watts with a 13.8-volt DC power source. Single sideband CW, AM, FM, as well as full D-Star functionality. Micro USB connector, Bluetooth, wireless LAN, and micro SD card slot are all standard equipment. Integrated GPS with antenna and GPS logger. And the HM243 speaker microphone is standard equipment. The ICOM IC705 has new accessories now available. The MBF705 desktop stand for just the right viewing angle on your desk, and the AH705 optional automatic antenna tuner that covers 1.8 MHz to 50 MHz bands with a 30-meter or 100-foot or longer wire antenna. The ICOM IC7300 is a high-performance, innovative HF transceiver with a compact design that will far exceed your expectations. This innovative HF transceiver digitizes RF before various receiver stages, reducing the generated inherent noise in different IF stages. This radio changed the way that entry-level HF transceivers are designed. Features include RF direct sampling, 15 discrete bandpass filters, a large 4.3-inch color touchscreen display, real-time spectrum scope, and an SD memory card slot. I have the ICOM IC7300, and it is by far the best HF transceiver that I have ever owned. It is always listening to 20-meter CW while I work. The ICOM IC7610 is the SDR transceiver that every ham wants. This high-performance SDR has the ability to pick out faint signals in the presence of stronger adjacent signals. The ICOM IC7610 is a direct sampling software-defined radio that has changed the world's definition of an SDR transceiver. Features include, but are not limited to, RF direct sampling system, 110 dB RMDR, independent dual receivers, you can be in 2 places at once, and dual Digicel. For more information, click on the banner ad in this week's show notes page to get to the ICOM America website and its fine line of amazing amateur radios. And when you finally go to buy your next ICOM radio, be sure to tell your dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO. Now, when you say movies, were you actually showing movies like using a projector?
TWA was one of the first, maybe the first airline to show movies on a airplane. And yes, these were projectors. They were mounted up in the ceiling in the center and projected onto a screen. And the projectors, of course, got to be fancier and better as time went on. So there was initially just one movie, and plus an audio, and there's a little thumb switch on the control box, and you could tune in to the movie audio or to one of several music channels as well. So it was a very big marketing advantage for TWA, and of course other airlines very quickly added their movies.
So did the flight attendants become projectionists, or was this kind of a system that kind of took care of itself?
Well, they had to turn it on, and usually they had to help individual passengers with how to use the controls and where to plug the headset in. The headsets were the audio, the sound type tubing. So there was no electronics in it. It was just two pieces of tubing attached to each other that went up like a stethoscope and pushed into a little 2-hole jack inside this control box, and the control box had the transducer. So not only did it hurt your ears to have it on very long, but if you moved around the scratchiness of the tubing against yourself, it was a bit disconcerting. But that's how it started. I
somehow remember that this system was in place, with the tubing, into the 80s, I think, right?
For a long time. In fact, Mad Magazine had a little spoof about the movie systems. And I remember this one because it came out while we were working on this. And there was this cartoon where this guy is yelling and screaming, and somebody to the side is saying, "What's going on?" And somebody else says, "Oh, they're just testing out the new stethoscope earphones."
I guess I understand now where this came from. But the projection units themselves required no maintenance in flight, and maybe that's why they showed one long leader, or was it a loop that came back around to the beginning so that it could be played on the next flight?
It was just a single pass. There was a company that would service the unit when the airplane landed and put in a new reel of film, and then take the old one back to rewind. And then they would close up the unit, which was in the ceiling of the 707. That's the aircraft that was being used. And so it was a matter of this company coming in and doing the servicing. In flight, all that happened was that the flight attendant would pull down the screen at the front, just like a kind of home movies type screen, and turn some switches. And if everything worked right, the movie would come on. If it didn't, then they would start apologizing, and in some cases maybe change the bulb out, because the bulb was probably the most prone to a problem. So the flight attendants had been trained to know how to do a bulb change.
What happened with your career after that? Did you stay at TWA throughout your career?
Well, I was there for a long, long time, almost 36 years. I was in engineering for about 3 years and getting a little antsy. I was a young guy and wanted to move onward, and I was in the back row of a desk, a series of desks, and there was about 4 or 5 desks ahead of me, and I could see my whole career moving from one desk to the other, and 20 years down the road being at that front desk. So several of us that were sort of in the same position. We were all in our early 20s, and all wanted to become president of the company in a few years, that type of thing. So we went back to school at the University of Missouri at Kansas City for the MBAs, and then my avenue for getting out of engineering was to take a position in the finance department as an analyst, a senior analyst, and so I was involved in doing cost studies, that sort of thing. And so that started a brand new career for me within TWA.
How did you like that compared to engineering?
Well, I thought of the management and engineering as kind of old fogey stuff. Now, you have to understand, I was like 23 years old, and they were in their 50s or something like that. So I was very anxious to get out. But, I look back on that time, and it was a great experience. And actually, the engineering department at TWA was held in very high esteem within the airline community.
Well, I would think so. You guys sounded like you were pioneers all the way around in the airline industry.
There were a lot of technological activities going on within engineering, and it was technically a very good company.
Now, it seems to me, in doing some of my research, I found an article, and I'll actually put it up on the website, that you wrote an article in 1964 for QST magazine where you actually built a mobile power supply, and in those days a mobile power supply had a high voltage supply for the transceiver that went in the car. It seemed to me that as busy as you were with your education and with TWA, that you had time to be a ham radio builder and a publisher. How did that start?
Ham radio, for me, besides the technical side of it, was a social outlet. At the time, I was very shy, and I had joined the radio club, the Johnson County Radio Club in Kansas City, and it became a social outlet for me where I could meet people and kind of learn how to become part of a group and not be quite so shy. So throughout this whole time period of my earlier days, ham radio was very important to me, and became a focus of my life. So that particular article was the result of buying a National NCX3 transceiver, which required a power supply for the car. And back then, the power supplies were very expensive. So I found an old 400 cycle or hertz toroid and rewound it and then put a bunch of transistors together. And so I made a transistorized power supply for my NCX3, and it worked out very well. And I decided to write an article. And in fact, I think it was my mentor, Jim McCoy, who suggested that. He had other articles. And it's sort of ironic that over the years I've had a number of articles, but out of my entire school career, from grade school through college, I only got one D, and that was in creative writing.
Well, although this article, it wasn't really creative writing, it was really kind of telling the story of this power supply.
Well, yeah, and that was my problem in that class was I couldn't think up a topic, but when I had a topic to work on, the words just kind of fell in place.
That's quite amazing. So it seems to me that a lot of people who are in their 20s, who have a professional career that they're pursuing, they maybe have a family that they're also pursuing in parallel. How did you have time for ham radio? How did you plan your time to be able to spend as much time in ham radio and actually build something and write about it?
Well, really, besides ham radio, I didn't have much else going in my life. As I said, I was very shy, didn't do hardly any dating, and just didn't participate in lots of things. I was pretty small and scrawny at the time, only put on my height later on, so I was no good in sports, and so ham radio was the focus, and fortunately it was there to help get me going.
Now, you wrote a number of articles since the very first one. So how did your ham radio career proceed from that point? You said earlier that perhaps CW wasn't your favorite operating mode. What is your favorite operating mode, and how did that develop?
Well, I didn't dislike CW. I just was never very good at it. So I was able to pass 13 words per minute, but that was about it. And I did do some CW work in my earlier days, but I quickly moved over to single sideband, and I had an aborted attempt at a single sideband transmitter back in, I think, 1959 using a phase shift unit, and that never saw the light of day. It was beyond my capabilities, and I didn't have the test equipment. So in 1960, I purchased a Gonset GSP 100 sideband transmitter, and then built a transmitting converter to up that to 2 meters. So I was putting out about 100 watts PEP on 2 meters, single sideband in 1960, and I think I was probably the first 2 meter sideband station in any of the surrounding states.
And did that make it difficult to make contacts under those circumstances?
Well, yes, in the sense that a lot of the guys were using like BC 348s and vintage stuff. They didn't even know where a BFO was on it. And so I would get on and kind of play around and call them in single sideband, and I'd get reports back like, hey, old man, your modulation is awful. You better check that out. But I had a fellow out in Hutchinson, Kansas, which is about 200 miles away, and he was running 800 watts AM, but he was very enthusiastic about sideband. He actually hadn't made the change yet. But we would carry on routine QSOs between ourselves over 200-mile circuit. He was running 800 AM, and I was running 100 watts sideband. And we were doing that very consistently where the rest of the guys in Kansas City on 2 meters were going 20 miles. And they actually thought, some of them thought that we were faking the QSOs.
At that time, Bob Heil, K0IZ, was very active on 2 meters in those days. Did you ever run into him?
No, I didn't. I just probably Hutchinson, Kansas was the most I was able to go distance-wise. And I had a small beam up on a tower at my folks' home, but it probably wasn't of the nature, and the other side of the contacts didn't have the quality of equipment to go much further.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA30N, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. When you left TWA, where did you go?
Well, I had TWA for 36 years. In 2001, American Airlines purchased TWA. TWA was running a good airline, but it had a series of financial problems over the years. And so American came along and bought TWA. My job disappeared as part of that turnover, so I wound up retiring from American Airlines. I was part owner in another company, a securities broker-dealer, which my brother-in-law and I formed. So I just moved over to that. I was president and CFO, and so for the next few years I was involved with that. So it made the transition okay.
What does the current rig look like now?
I have my main stations in Colorado. We moved officially to Colorado 10 years ago. And I have a Collins KWM2A, 75S3B, 30L1, and an amp supply LK800. That's my vintage station. I have also an Elcraft K3, which I purchased to do remote operations. And then in Kansas City, I didn't have anything other than running that station remotely until a couple years ago when I built up a homebrew tube radio, then last year an amplifier to go with it. So I can run that equipment here in Kansas City when I'm here, or I can run the remote station.
Now, one of the reasons that we're talking is that I actually saw your 13-tube single sideband transceiver. You published it in one of the magazines. Since I get all of them, I'm not sure which one. But I think I just saw it recently, and that's why I sent the message to you. Can you talk a little bit about why anyone in 2018, or whenever you started the project, would build a 13-tube single sideband transceiver?
Yeah, the article was in February 2021, Electric Radio magazine. The radio club here has an annual auction, and I bought a military test unit a few years earlier because it had this really neat dial on it, and I thought, I'm going to make something with that. So I took it apart and found inside this beautiful, beautiful variable capacitor with this great gear drive on it, and I decided I needed to build something with that, a VFO maybe, I didn't know. So I looked at that thing for a couple of years, and then along came COVID, and it became the impetus for me to start thinking about doing something with that part, with that variable capacitor. So if I had never bought that unit, I probably would have never started the project. Anyway, as it turned out, when it was all over with, I never actually used it.
You never actually used the transceiver?
No, I actually never used the variable capacitor. Yeah, so it was the impetus to do it, but I, changed my mind along the way.
And where did the design come from? Now, you've written articles on antenna design. You've actually written articles on just about every area of ham radio. How did you come up with the design for the transceiver?
Well, once I started going in the direction of doing a transceiver, I dug through my old handbooks. I have a collection of QSTs going back to into the 30s, CQ Magazine's ham radio magazine, and 73 magazine. So I just started looking around, digging around. I had built a 80-meter single sideband transceiver back in 1961. It was a copy of a QST article earlier in that year, and it really worked terrific. Later on, I tried to build a multi-band one, and it was beyond my capabilities. So I eventually tore it back down and put the parts back in stock. So I gradually decided it was feasible to do. My criteria was I wanted to make a radio for 20 meters because that's the primary band I operate, and I wanted it to be a no-compromise radio, one that I could use without apologies, but use tubes in it. And so I did a lot of borrowing of ideas and, gradually put together my thoughts. And those thoughts changed as, I continued to look at and read about various ideas.
Now, the fact is that people are still building tube-type equipment. I think guitar amplifiers, high-end guitar amplifiers and even high-end audio systems are still tubes. Did you build this tube system on a printed circuit board, or did you do point-to-point wiring like you would do in the 60s?
Point-to-point. Lots of metal work involved with tube projects. And so my construction technique was highly traditional. I also had to work very hard to try to make it as small as possible. So it's really quite compact radio for a tube project.
And what does your metal shop look like?
Not a whole lot. I have a drill press, a bandsaw, a homemade little brake that uses pieces of wood and a hinge. Of course, hand drills and files and things like that. So I don't have anything extensive. I do have a nice set of socket punches, though, which is virtually required if you're going to do anything with tubes.
Right, because you have to punch the holes and then also drill the holes for lining up the tube socket as well?
Yes, there's a lot of metal work involved. That's why when printed circuits came along, the prices dropped noticeably in terms of what you got for your dollars.
Now, did you have any problem finding the parts for a project like this? Or are these parts that you just had all these years and took most of the project parts from your own stock?
Most of the parts I had already in junk boxes. A lot of those boxes I hadn't opened up for many, many years because I hadn't done a tube project in probably 50 years. But there are some parts that are very difficult to find, like IF transformers, variable capacitors. Those are the two things that come to mind. Tubes are not a problem. There are lots of tubes out there, and they're relatively inexpensive unless they happen to be a type of tube that the guitar amp and audio people want.
Right, then they're really big bucks.
Yeah, actually, I probably have quite a fortune in tubes here that, for a long time I thought weren't of much value, but I suspect some of them are now.
Now, did you have the IF transformers and the variable capacitors, or did you have to go out and source those?
The IF transformers, I found somebody on eBay that was selling them and bought them from them. The little trimmer capacitors were always very difficult to find, and people think that they're extremely valuable, something that probably was 50 cents back in the 50s or 60s. Somebody was wanting $25 for. So, you just can't spend that kind of money on a project. it took a lot of digging around and asking around. My loading variable capacitor, I never was able to find one that I wanted with the size, and I wound up buying one from MFJ. So it was a little expensive, but it did what I wanted it to do.
Now, I guess now that COVID is over, do you go to live hamfests? And when you go to live hamfests, are you looking for parts or equipment?
Well, I haven't gone to a hamfest since any of that has started up. The radio club here in Kansas City, when I'm here, they have a very nice auction in October, and I have purchased a number of things. Typically, what I'm looking for, most people aren't looking for. I'll buy old stuff because of the parts that might be in it.
Working or not, right?
Working or not, I'm just after the parts.
Do you have advice for someone that might want to build vintage equipment or maintain it in terms of what they should be looking for at Hamfest?
Well, certainly you can't afford to buy most of the stuff on eBay. You'll spend way too much money. So a Hamfest and also people that you might know, you kind of put out the word. When I started building the amplifier last year, I decided I was going to use 813 tubes, and that's a terrific tube. It's equivalent of about two 811s or one 572. And I didn't have any, but I quickly came up with a pair. And then when people found out I was building and looking for 813s, I now have about 15 of them that have been donated to me. So word of mouth works.
Now, when you're using 813s in a pair, this is kind of a push-pull arrangement?
It's a grounded grid circuit, very traditional. The first 813 grounded grid came out in early 50s, probably about 1953 or so, and became very popular. It was the predecessor of all of the grounded grid amplifiers using tubes that are still out there to this very day. And it has a lot of advantages for the grounded grid. Grounded grid takes more power to drive, so it matches up better to the radio. It has a good intermodulation product because of the negative feedback in it, and it's a very easy circuit to work with.
Now that you have 15 tubes, do you have to match the pair in order to make the amplifier work right?
I actually didn't. I'm still using the very first two that were given to me. One is dated 1943, the other's 1944, and RCA tubes with the military designation on them. I was concerned when I first was going to power it up that the tube might have had some gassing inside of it. So reading online about how to do this, I first ran the tubes with just filament for an hour or so. Then I put some B plus on it at half voltage, about 1100 volts, and ran it that way for another half hour or so. And everything seemed to be going pretty good. So then I put some drive in with the B plus still at half voltage, and started watching the tubes. And it's kind of a good thing that I did it that way, because I saw little sparks and little hot spots inside, little glowing points and so forth. And after about half an hour, I guess the getter in the tubes did what they were supposed to do. And all of that mystery stuff went away, and that's the tubes I'm still using.
What kind of test equipment do you have on your bench?
Well, one of the pieces of test equipment that I used a lot of was a 1948 Millen grid dip meter, grid dip oscillator. I actually have two of them. I could use that to check resonances, wind my coils, and so forth. So it's a terrific unit. They're not very common anymore, but very handy. I have a nice 400 meg 4-channel Tektronix scope, a Hewlett-Packard 1 gigahertz synthesized frequency generator, a 1.3 gigahertz frequency counter, and I built up a rubidium frequency standard, so I drive both the frequency generator and the counter with that, so I have ultra-high frequency accuracy.
We will return to our guests in just a moment. A new way to show your support of the QSO Today podcast is to buy me a coffee. I consume gallons of coffee to create this weekly podcast. Invite me for coffee by pushing the yellow button, Buy Me a Coffee, on the QSO Today show notes page. And now back to our QSO Today. Have you built other equipment using this test bench and metal shop?
I've built some small stuff along the way. As I said, these two projects were my first two projects in about 50 years. But I also built a audio interface unit, which we use at field day. One of the problems that ran into at field day was that you're operating and you have people behind you talking, and so it can be very distracting. So I created a design. It was in QST and in some of the handbooks of an interface unit where the operator and the logger plug into it and can talk back and forth to each other. And then the next iteration of that, I adapted it to use aviation headsets. And I moved in that direction because an aviation headset has about a 25 dB sound suppression on the earphones. So if somebody's talking behind you, they aren't going to distract you. So I created a circuitry to modify the output of the microphone on an aviation headset to be compatible with a ham radio. And so that's built into the audio interface unit. And I also built a little standalone adapter, which was in QST.
Now, you're talking like the Dave Clark headsets, the green ones?
Yes. The aviation headsets are all built to the same standard. They're very standardized so that anybody's headset will plug into any aircraft. The problem in using them with ham radio is the microphone was originally a carbon microphone, and now it's an electret mic element, but it emulates a carbon microphone, so the impedance and the outputs are not suitable for ham radio equipment. So my adapter circuit deals with that.
Now, those headsets are quite expensive. Do you think that they're still a better headset than an amateur radio headset that's in the same price range?
Well, I just bought a couple spares because one of mine, the cable on it was starting to go bad on me, and I thought, well, I want to have some spares around for field day. And one of these was new. It was not a David Clark, of course, but I paid $91 for it. The other one I paid $60, and the David Clarks are always expensive. They're in the $300 and up category, and certainly worth it. They're very well constructed, but for ham radio use, we can get by with something that's a little less durable. And so the ones that I have are none of them are David Clarks, but they all do a good job.
And, of course, when you're outside or you're in a crowded field day site, having that headset, and I guess you also have a logging person there as well, right? So the box you created allows someone to plug in their headset as well?
Yes, the one side of it is for the operator. The other side is for the logger. The operator and the logger can talk back and forth, but the operator's voice only goes out over the radio. And then there's also a subsection to the circuit to plug in an external speaker so that people besides the two people operating can hear what's going on.
Did you think to use maybe surplus air transducer plug like you have in the TWA armrests that you could probably put in the system and use stethoscope earphones too?
Oh, I hated those things back then. I'd never do that.
It would be funny, I guess, perhaps.
Yeah, I would think that probably they might still be sold someplace.
Now, you mentioned that you have a remote control station in Colorado and that right now you're in Kansas City. You actually even wrote an article about this. I think it's August of 2012, QST. I think I saw an article there about your remote station or about remote controlling a station. What have you learned in terms of remote controlling a station that's far off Do you have people there already on site that could like restart it or reboot it if the thing stopped working?
Well, the first thing that I ran into was trying to adapt my equipment to the internet, dealing with latency and a lot of the little settings that would improve the interface that I have. Out in Colorado, my internet connection is a 3 gigahertz link, 3.6 gigahertz link to a tower about a dozen miles away, and so it's like fixed wireless. I'm quite remote. I'm in the mountains, so there are times when the internet connection is not as good as it would be in a more urban area, and so I have to protect my bandwidth as best as I can. So I had to learn a lot about tuning of the circuitry. The other thing that I had to work with was dealing with the fact that there is nobody out there when I'm here in Kansas City. So I use my PC for audio, and I can also use it for other things, but it's the primary use for it is audio. Well, Windows, there's problems with Windows, and it tries to do updates. It does various strange things. So I had to develop ways to remotely control the PC, to turn it on and off, to do a hard reset, those kinds of things. First few years, I had my neighbor go over to my house to look at the screen and tell me what it was doing, but that can wear out pretty fast. So trying to deal with remote situations when you're not there is a bit of a struggle. I also, again, because of the internet, needed a way to do a hard shutdown of everything. So if my internet went out, and it does from time to time, and I've got all my equipment running, how do I shut it down? I mean, I don't want it to continue to transmit. So in this case, I use some somewhat older technology called X10, and I have an X10 responder on the telephone line, and I can dial into that, and that X10 controls a master relay, which then can shut everything down until the problem's gone away.
So you actually have a copper phone line that services your house?
Yes, I do. Originally, that was really the only choice. Now the cell service is relatively good, but I keep the landline there for backup as well as for that particular purpose. I also have on that system the ability to, in the wintertime, as I'm headed back out there, to turn on my heat remotely, so it's nice and toasty when I get out there.
I'm curious about the 3 gigahertz link. Was that something that you put in?
No, this is a little company out there that specializes in providing internet connections to remote areas, and that equipment has changed several times. It was originally a 5 gigahertz link, 2.5, and right now, the latest iteration of it is, I think it's 3.6 gigahertz. And for whatever the reason, they said that was going to give me the best service. So it's not as good as, an urban environment, but I once had dial-up, and you can imagine what that was like.
I guess it's Moore's Law, right? Every year it gets progressively better, so that your ability to control the station is even better?
Definitely so. I mean, the outages are not nearly as often, and the slow speeds are not too bad. Usually it's maybe something on my end that's causing things. I haven't rebooted the router for a while or something like that. When I run it remotely, it does very well. To give you an idea, we were doing a remote setup of a special event here in Kansas City, and one of the fellows that I kind of got started on contesting, he hit a 20-minute rate of 170 an hour, which is very good, not only in its own right, but also remotely.
What is the antenna system up there? It sounds to me like if you're in a rural area, you can do just about anything you want. But you're also then in the mountains of Colorado, which is subject to some weather, right?
We have pretty high winds in our immediate area, so I've not been inclined to put up a tower. I have long wire V-beams, so I have 4 legs. They're 180 feet long that come together on a tree, basically a half circle. And I have traps, coaxial traps in them, so it's a tuned antenna. And at the tree, I've got a box with a ballon and relays, and I can select between the 4 wires and have 6 different combinations of a pair and steer the antenna. And I had an article in, I guess 05 in QST, and it has, the antenna has very high gain. All V-beam antennas, it's an old style antenna, basically. They produce very high gain. So when I'm running my station, and I'll run 1,500 watts with my vintage amp and the L-Craft K3, and I can work anything that I can hear.
Do you have a backup generation up there?
I have 530 watts of solar and a bunch of batteries and an inverter, and it's just used strictly for emergency type service. It's not tied into the grid, and I'm normally not using it, but it comes into play if I have an outage.
Is your rig floating across the batteries, or only when there's a power outage?
The inverter will switch over to the batteries, but the router and all of my internet is on the UPS.
What do you think the greatest challenge facing amateur radio is now?
I think it's others have said, bringing new people, bringing young people into the hobby. I've been around for a long time, and I value a lot of the things I've been involved in. But it's a new day, and some of the things that attracted me and others back in the day aren't necessarily going to be an attraction to those in the future. I mean, being able to talk to somebody on the other side of the world was a phenomenal thing to do 50 or 60 years ago. It's pretty blasé these days. It takes a different enticement to bring people in. I'm a big fan of clubs. I think a lot of people have an interest. Some of them will get licensed, and then nothing happens because they don't have anybody to learn from or share ideas with. So here in Kansas City, the club that I'm a member of, I was a member when I was a teenager. There's about 30 clubs in Kansas City. This is a hotbed of ham radio, and but I know that's not the case everywhere.
What's the name of your club?
It's W0ERH. Johnson County Radio Amateurs Club. It's, I think, the biggest club in Kansas City. It has several repeaters and a big field day operation. They have run many, many licensed classes, and I think probably they are somewhere well past 1,000 people that they have licensed over the years.
And are they pretty good at following up with the people that take their courses and pass their license?
In addition to the technician class, licensed class and testing, they also will do for general and extra class. Every field day, for example, they're doing licensing. In addition to that, they have get on the air tutorials for bringing people in who have never done anything with their equipment. Maybe they don't know how to program their handheld, that kind of thing. So it's a hands-on, let's get you going type of class.
What does the demographic look like of the new hams? Are they getting kids?
Our club here has a pretty broad range of demographics. I would say about 15% are females, maybe even approaching 20%. I would say the average age, I'm definitely on the older end of it. Average age is probably in the 45 to 50, which is the median, let's say. Quite a few younger ones. It's not a club that's dying of old age. It's a club that continues to bring in new people.
What excites you the most about what's happening in ham radio now?
I like special events. I like contesting, and I like the challenge of trying to do better at those kinds of things. One of the special events that I have enjoyed very much here over the last few years is at the National World War I Museum in Kansas City. And there's a club there, WW1 USA, and starting in 2014, doing special events several times a year, commemorating the 100th anniversary of various things in World War I. And so I started going there, bringing my laptop and running remote operations, using it as an opportunity for a tutorial for people that weren't very exposed to HF operation. They, had their technicians or even other classes, but just had not been on HF. And then more specifically, in a pseudo contest type of operation. And what I have found is that some of the younger people really get into that contesting. There's one fellow, for example, I'll mention by name, Jack DePaulo, WZ1 Yankee, young guy. I think he's 19 now, maybe 18. And he first showed up at one of the WW1 USA special events, got him going on HF. We worked together. He's done several special events with me now, and he's the guy that I mentioned that had a rate of 170 an hour on 20-meter sideband the last time we operated the special event. He put me to shame. I only did 150.
So what you like about the special event is that you're the source of the pileup.
Yeah, exactly. If I could go on a de-expedition, I would love that.
Are there other contests that you like and operate?
I have done the Colorado QSO party a number of times and have several plaques on the wall from first place finishes using my vintage Collins station. So that's always been fun.
What advice would you give to new or returning hams to the hobby?
See if you can find a good club in the area to join up with. The social aspects of it, the interaction, the ability to talk about what's going on. As I said, Kansas City, we're very fortunate that there's so much going on, and it may not be the case everywhere. But I think being able to associate with other hams is highly valuable.
Face to face.
Face to face.
I think I agree with you as well. John, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. I really appreciate your spending this hour with me.
Well, it's my pleasure, Eric.
73.
73 to you.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with John. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in K0IZ in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to ICOM America for its support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of ICOM America by clicking on their banner in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any other episode into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 400. QSO Today is now available in the iHeart, Radio, Spotify, YouTube, and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use the Amazon Echo and say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." My thanks to Ben Bresky, who edits every single show and allows both this host and my guest to sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.